Carol Chessman, the infamous red light bandit, pretended to be a police officer so that he could rob and sexually assault women. He was convicted in 1948 on 17 felony counts. Although Chessman hadn't killed anyone, the 2 kidnapping counts qualified him for the death penalty under a stringent California anti-kidnapping statute. The mountain of evidence against Chessman, which included 3 victims who unequivocally identified him, was compelling. Nevertheless, over the next 12 years, Chessman managed to make himself into an international cause célèbre, in part by writing several books professing his innocence, one of which, Cell 2455 Death Row, was made into a 1955 movie. Numerous celebrities, including former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and evangelist Billy Graham, supported his cause. On February 1960, California Governor Edmund Pat Brown granted Chessman his 8th stay of execution, citing the concern that his execution might trigger demonstrations against President Eisenhower when he visited Uruguay. But when that stay expired, prison officials quickly moved to execute him. On May 2, 1960, the day of his scheduled execution at San Quentin, his lawyer got a federal judge to issue another stay, just 1 minute before the cyanide pellets were to be dropped into the gas chamber. The judge's secretary called San Quentin, but misdialed the number. By the time she got through, the pellets were already dropped and no one could enter the chamber without dying themselves. Chessman's execution went on till he finally succumbed to the gas. James Douglas Latham and George Ronald York, who are mentioned in the Truman Capote true crime book In Cold Blood, were scheduled to hang at midnight at a prison in Lansing, Kansas, for the 1961 murder of Otto Ziegler. He was one of 7 they reportedly killed on what the Associated Press characterized as a cross-country crime orgy. The 2 killers were allowed to order their last meal and then were given a bizarre fringe benefit. They could let the warden flip a coin to determine what would be the order of hanging. Kansas only had a single trap gallows. Latham called the toss and lost, which meant he would go first. But before their sentence could be carried out, a federal appeals court had granted a 30-day stay, after their lawyer argued that their rights had been violated because they hadn't had counsel at a preliminary hearing. All in all, Latham's and York's legal maneuvers won them 5 postponements of their execution. But on June 22, 1965, after 4 years on death row, their luck ran out. Shortly before their necks were placed in the noose, the 2 dropped the guise of angry defiance. "I know it won't do much good to say I'm sorry, but I know God has forgiven me, and I hope you people see fit to do the same," York said. This time, the wire service account didn't mention a coin toss or the order in which they were hanged. 1950s spree killer Charles Starkweather may be most remembered today as the inspiration for Martin Sheen's character Kit in the 1973 film Badlands, and for Bruce Springsteen's 1982 song Nebraska, in which he explains his crimes by saying, "Well, sir, I guess there's just a meanness in this world." In real life, the 20-year-old wasn't half as handsome as a young Sheen, and he was no existentialist philosopher either, but rather an all but illiterate sociopath who robbed and killed 11 people because, as a psychiatrist testified, the act of killing meant to him no more than stepping on a bug. Nevertheless, in the early morning hours of May 22, 1959, just 90 minutes before Starkweather was scheduled to die in the electric chair at Nebraska State Penitentiary, a federal judge granted a stay of execution requested by Starkweather's father, Guy. Starkweather's family, claiming their son's court-appointed lawyers had erred by putting on an insanity defense rather than trying to raise doubts about his guilt, had fired them, leaving him without counsel. Even so, because the move had left Starkweather without a lawyer, the judge felt compelled to hold up his execution so that the prisoner could find a lawyer and submit a writ to an appeals court. The reprieve didn't save him for long. Just then, a little more than a month later, on June 25, 1959, he was summoned to the death chamber. His last words reportedly were, "What's your hurry?" Ted Bundy, a serial killer who may have killed more than 36 young women, was once described by journalist Hugh Ainsworth as the most profound enigma in the history of U.S. criminal justice. Bundy, who was sentenced to die in 1978 for savagely bludgeoning 2 women to death in a college sorority house, and received another death sentence in 1980 for abducting and killing a 12-year-old girl, was as sick a monster as they come. Yet he was also handsome, articulate, and charismatic enough to draw scores of admiring groupies to the courtroom. And despite having multiple death sentences, the former law student managed to stay alive in prison for nearly a decade, in part by deftly manipulating the system to cause delays. For example, he twice sought postponements of a clemency hearing, and then on the eve of the third fired his attorney in an attempt to put it off one more time. Bundy also won multiple stays of execution. In November 1986, 2 hours after a federal judge in Orlando rejected his appeal, he got a 3-judge federal appeals panel to grant him an indefinite stay. The order came at 12:50 a.m., just 6 hours before he was to be executed. On January 24, 1989, though, Bundy finally ran out of tricks, kept his date with Old Sparky, and was electrocuted at Florida State Prison. Troy Davis was convicted in Georgia of the 1989 fatal shooting of an off-duty police officer who came to the assistance of a homeless man who was being beaten by a group of assailants that included Davis. But his guilt in the murder was challenged by the NAACP and the Innocence Project, an organization that has exonerated 18 death row inmates between 1992 and 2012. 7 of the 9 trial witnesses against Davis later recanted their testimony, adding to the outcry against his execution. Some said one of the 2 remaining witnesses was the real killer. About 630,000 people signed petitions asking that his execution be stopped. In 2007, a state parole board temporarily blocked his execution with just hours to spare, and the following year, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened just 90 minutes before he was to die, though it eventually declined to hear his case. On September 20, 2011, Davis's execution was put on hold one more time, as the Supreme Court reviewed a last-ditch petition from his lawyers. But unfortunately for him, the justices decided not to intervene. Just before 11 p.m., 4 hours after the scheduled time, Davis was walked into the death chamber. He continued to maintain his innocence, even looking the family of the murdered officer in the eye and telling them, "I did not personally kill your son, father, brother. All I can ask is that you delve deeper into this case so you really can finally see the truth." 8 minutes later, he was pronounced dead.